She called me on a Tuesday. I remember because I'd just come back from my cardiologist appointment, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, still wearing my coat. "Dad," she said, and her voice had that particular flatness she'd picked up from him, from my son-in-law, over the years they'd been married. Not warmth, not cruelty exactly, just the sound of someone who had already decided something and was only calling as a formality. "We're moving to Calgary next month. I've listed the cottage. It's already under offer." I set down my mug. The cottage on Morrison Lake had been in our family for 31 years. My wife Helen and I had bought it the summer. Our daughter was 7, the year after I made partner at the firm. 2.5 acres on the water, a dock we'd rebuilt ourselves twice, a wood stove in the corner of the main room that took a particular kind of coaxing to light in October. Helen had picked out every piece of furniture in that place. The blue curtains in the bedroom were still the ones she'd hung the year before she got sick. "Audrey," I said. Just her name. I didn't know what else to say yet. "It makes no sense to keep paying property tax on it when we're moving west," she said. "You don't drive anymore. When's the last time you were even out there?" She wasn't wrong that I didn't drive. I'd given up my license 2 years prior, after my second minor stroke. But I took the bus to Bracebridge, and my neighbor Doug had driven me up on a few weekends. I'd been there the previous August, sat on the dock with a coffee and watched the loons. I'd told Audrey about it. She hadn't asked any follow-up questions. "I want to talk about this in person," I said. "There isn't really anything to talk about, Dad. It's under offer. The buyers want a late September closing." A pause. "I'll send you your share of the proceeds when it goes through. It'll be a nice chunk for you." My share. The cottage was mine. It had always been mine. When Helen died, it passed to me outright. I'd checked years ago with our estate lawyer, just to be careful. I had never added Audrey's name to the deed. There had never been any reason to, or so I thought. What my daughter didn't know was that approximately 6 months before that phone call, I'd had a very specific conversation with a man named Clifford Haynes at a firm in Huntsville. And Clifford had helped me do something that, at the time, even I wasn't entirely sure I'd ever need. But let me go back, because the cottage was only part of it. Audrey was our only child. Helen and I had tried for more, and when it became clear that Audrey would be it, we didn't love her less for it. We probably loved her more, or at least more anxiously. She was bright, sharp, the kind of kid who corrected her teachers and was usually right. I was proud of her in the way that fathers are proud when they see their own best qualities reflected back, even if the reflection is a little distorted. She married Derek when she was 29. I'll be honest, I didn't take to him immediately, but I told myself that was just the usual father of the bride reluctance, the irrational sense of being displaced. Derek was in commercial real estate, which meant he talked about money the way other people talk about the weather. Constantly, casually, as if it were the shared backdrop to all human experience. He had an opinion on every asset, every holding, every piece of property anyone in his vicinity owned, including mine. It started small, years ago. Comments at Thanksgiving about whether I was making the most of my RRSP drawdown. Questions about what I was planning to do with the Morrison Lake property long term. A suggestion, once, that I might want to consider putting it in a numbered company for tax purposes, and maybe he could help me look into that. I'd always smiled and changed the subject. After Helen died, it became less subtle. Derek started calling on his own, without Audrey, which had never happened before in 20 years of knowing him. He'd ask how I was doing, and within 10 minutes we'd somehow arrive at questions about the cottage, about my savings, about whether I had a current will, and whether it might be worth revisiting given the changed circumstances. I mentioned it to Audrey once. She said I was being paranoid. She said Derek was just trying to help, that he had professional expertise and it made sense that he'd want to share it with family. She said it with a tired patience that made me feel like a child who'd misread a social situation. I let it go. But I started paying attention in a different way. The summer before last, I overheard a phone conversation. I wasn't eavesdropping. They'd come up to visit for a long weekend, which had been happening less and less frequently. And I'd come back up from the dock earlier than expected because the black flies were bad. The screen door was open. Derek was in the kitchen, and his voice carried. Assessed at 1.1, but in this market you'd clear 1.4 easy, maybe 1.5 if you stage it right. By the time the dust settles on everything, we're looking at a very comfortable position. He stopped when he heard the screen door. Just talking to my brother, he said. He held up his phone and smiled. I nodded and went to get a glass of water. That night I lay in the narrow bed in the main bedroom, Helen's blue curtains moving gently in the lake breeze, and I thought for a long time about what I knew and what I could do about it. I had a good mind. Strokes notwithstanding, my mind was still good. I'd spent 35 years as a tax lawyer. I understood what documents meant, what their absence meant, what could be done with property and what could not. The cottage deed had always been in my name alone. But I was 68 years old, recovering from 2 strokes, and I lived alone in a house in Sudbury. I was, in the eyes of people who thought in those terms, a manageable problem, so I called Clifford Haynes. Clifford was a property and estates lawyer who'd been recommended to me by a colleague I'd worked with at the firm before I retired. Doug drove me up to Huntsville on a Wednesday morning in March, and I spent 2 hours in Clifford's office explaining what I wanted to do. I wanted to place the Morrison Lake property in a family trust, not a numbered company, a proper discretionary trust, with me as the settlor and the sole trustee during my lifetime, and with a charitable remainder provision that meant if I died without having explicitly transferred the beneficial interest to a named individual, a portion would flow to a land conservation charity I'd supported for years. More importantly, I wanted the cottage registered with the Ontario Land Registry in a way that would be immediately visible to any title search. No surprises, no undisclosed interests. Just a very clear chain of ownership that ended with me, in a structure that could not be quietly unwound by anyone else. Clifford had looked at me over his reading glasses and asked if I was expecting trouble. I'm a tax lawyer, I'd told him. I don't expect trouble. I prepare for it. He'd smiled at that. We'd spent the rest of the morning going through the documents. By the time Audrey called me that Tuesday in August, the trust had been registered for 6 months. I didn't tell her any of that on the phone. I said I'd like to have a proper conversation about it, that there were some things she didn't seem to be aware of, and could she and Derek come to Sudbury that weekend or the next? She said she was busy. She said the buyers were motivated, and the real estate market in cottage country was unpredictable, and honestly, Dad, this is the practical thing to do. I said, Audrey, the cottage is in a trust. It can't be listed for sale without my explicit written consent as trustee. If someone has listed it, they've done so without proper title authority, and that's a significant legal problem. A long silence. What do you mean? A trust? I mean that approximately 6 months ago I transferred the Morrison Lake property into a family trust for which I am the sole trustee. Any real estate agent who listed that property without conducting a title search has exposed themselves to liability, and any offer that's been accepted is not legally binding because the person who accepted it did not have the authority to do so. Another silence. Longer this time. Derek handles all the... I'm sure he does, I said. That's why I'm telling you to have him call his lawyer before close of business today. And Audrey, I want you to understand that I'm not angry, but we need to talk face to face this weekend." She came. Derek did not. She arrived Saturday afternoon, drove the 4 hours from Toronto alone, and sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same way she'd sat there as a teenager after she'd done something she knew she couldn't fully justify. I'd made tea. She hadn't touched hers. "I didn't know about the trust," she said. "I know you didn't. Derek said the property was yours outright to dispose of." "It is. I disposed of it into a trust. That's a legitimate disposal." He said. She stopped, started again. He had someone run a search. Then their search was incomplete, or they found the trust registration and chose not to mention it to you. I watched her face as she processed that. "I'm not going to tell you which I think it is. That's something you'll need to work out with him." She was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the neighbor's maple was starting to turn, the red coming in at the edges of the leaves, the way it does in Sudbury in late August. "Was it always about the cottage?" she finally asked, and her voice was different. The flatness was gone. "I think," I said carefully, "that the cottage was the most concrete thing, but I don't think it was the only thing." She started crying then, not dramatically. Audrey had never been a dramatic crier, even as a child. Just quiet tears, sitting with her hands around her cold mug. I didn't move to comfort her right away. I'm not proud of that. But I needed her to sit in that room with what had nearly happened. Helen and I had built a life. We'd worked for decades in the particular grinding, honest way that people of our generation worked, without family money, without windfalls, just time and discipline and a few good decisions made at the right moments. The cottage was 31 years of that. It was Helen's curtains, and my rebuilt dock, and our granddaughter's first steps on that uneven flagstone path by the water. It was not a liquidity event. I need to tell you what happened with the listing because it had its own complications. It turned out the real estate agent, a young woman from a brokerage in Gravenhurst, had conducted a title search, found the trust, and flagged it to Derek. Derek had told her the trust was administrative, that I'd given verbal consent, and that the formal paperwork would follow. She had perhaps naively accepted that and listed the property anyway. Clifford Haynes sent her brokerage a letter the following week. I'm not going to pretend there wasn't some satisfaction in that, not cruelty. I didn't want anyone's career ruined. But there is a specific feeling that comes from having prepared carefully for something and watching the preparation work exactly the way you intended. I'd spent 35 years making that machinery work for clients. It was quietly gratifying to see it work for me. The listing was withdrawn. The offer, which had never been legally valid, was voided. The buyers were disappointed but not damaged. Clifford's letter was careful about that. Derek called me once, about 2 weeks after all of this. I let it go to voicemail. His message was measured and professional, the tone of a man who has recalculated and decided that conciliation is now the correct strategy. He said he thought there had been a miscommunication. He said he'd never intended to act without my knowledge. He said he hoped we could get together soon, the three of us, and straighten things out. I didn't call him back. I showed Audrey the voicemail the next time I saw her, which was Thanksgiving, and I let her form her own conclusions. She's a smart woman. She always has been. What I want to tell you about is the weekend after Clifford's letter went out. Doug drove me up to Morrison Lake on the last Friday of September. The leaves were full color, that particular northern Ontario brightness that you can't describe adequately to anyone who hasn't seen it. The birch going yellow and the maples going every shade from burnt orange to deep red, all of it reflecting off the gray water on a cool morning. I unlocked the cottage, went in, opened the windows. The smell was the same as always, wood and must and the particular mineral smell of lake air. I lit the wood stove. It took 3 tries, the way it always does when it's been sitting unused. I stood in the main room and watched the fire catch through the glass panel of the stove door. Helen's curtains moved in the draft from the window I'd left cracked. I made coffee in the old percolator we'd had since 1987, and I sat on the dock with it, in a jacket and a wool hat, and watched a pair of loons work the far edge of the bay. They were probably the same pair we'd watched for years, or their descendants. It's hard to say with loons. They return to the same territories generation after generation. I thought about my daughter. I thought about what a marriage can do to a person over 20 years, how it can shift you by degrees in a direction you'd never have chosen alone, until you're standing somewhere you don't fully recognize and making decisions that would have been foreign to the person you used to be. I didn't exonerate her, but I tried to understand. I thought about Helen, who had always been the one in our family who understood people more generously than I did, who would have found a way to be both firm and kind at the same time. I had managed the firmness. I was still working on the rest. My granddaughter, Becca, Audrey's daughter, who was 11 and fierce and reminded me of her mother at that age in all the best ways, was going to come up the following summer. I'd already told her about the loons. She'd asked whether they mated for life, and I'd said yes, and she'd said that was nice. It was nice. The water was cold and flat, and the sky above the tree line was the clear, pale blue that comes in October in the Shield country, and I sat there with my coffee going cold, and I thought, this is still here. All of it, still here. Some things you protect, not because you are afraid of losing them, but because they're worth the trouble of protecting. Because someone should. I'd been that someone. I still was. The loons called once across the water and then went quiet, and I sat there until the coffee was gone and the morning had turned, and then I went back inside and had another cup, standing at the kitchen window, watching the dock and the water and the yellow birch at the edge of the tree line, doing what birch trees do every October in this country. Letting go of everything they don't need and standing there anyway, bright and particular and entirely themselves. I think about that Tuesday phone call more than I probably should. Not with bitterness. That passed sometime around the second cup of coffee on the dock that October morning, but with a kind of quiet attention, the way you look back at a near miss on the highway and try to understand exactly what saved you. What saved me wasn't luck. I want to be clear about that. Luck would have been a careless mistake on Derek's end, or a conscientious title agent who caught the listing and flagged it independently. What actually saved me was a decision I'd made on a cold Wednesday morning in March, driving up to Huntsville with Doug, because I'd heard a phone call I wasn't meant to hear, and I'd had the sense to take it seriously. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the legal mechanism, the trust, Clifford's letter, all of that, but the choice that came before it. The choice to act on what I knew rather than explain it away. I'd spent a long time being polite about Derek's questions, telling myself I was being paranoid, that no one inside a family would actually do what I suspected, and maybe that generosity of interpretation is appropriate for a while. But there's a point where it stops being generosity and starts being a kind of willful blindness, and I think I'd been standing on that line for longer than I want to admit. Helen would have seen it sooner. She had a way of knowing when something was wrong with people, not cynically, not suspiciously, just accurately. I always admired that in her and figured I'd made up for not having it myself by being the one who understood documents and structures and legal implications. Turns out you need both. You need to see people clearly, and you need to know what to do once you've seen them. Audrey is still my daughter. That didn't change. What changed? What I hope changed is that she started looking at the man she'd married with a little more of her mother's clarity and a little less of the comfortable stories she'd been telling herself. I can't know that for certain. We don't talk about Derek directly. But she came up to the cottage in July with Becca, and she sat on the dock for a long time without saying much, and when she left, she hugged me at the door in a way she hadn't for years. I'll take that. What I'd tell anyone in a position like mine, any parent watching something they built with their own hands start to slip towards someone else's grip, is this: paying attention is not the same as being suspicious, and protecting what you've built is not the same as being unkind. I loved my daughter, and I still protected myself from what she was being used to do. Those two things can be true at the same time. They were true at the same time. There's a kind of steadiness that comes from having done the difficult thing before you needed to, from having thought clearly when the stakes were low enough that you still could. I'm 68 years old, and I've had 2 strokes, and I live alone in Sudbury, and I am, by most external measures, someone who could reasonably be managed. What I know is that I am not. What I know is that the mind I built over 35 years of careful work is still mine, and I used it, and it held. The loons came back this spring. Becca asked me how I knew they were the same ones, and I told her I didn't. Not for certain, but they'd come back to the same bay, the same territory, the same water they'd always known. That's enough, I said. Sometimes that's all you can ask. She thought about that for a moment, and then said that made sense to her. It does to me too.